Good evening, Beulah family, and anybody else that may be watching our study tonight. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to continue on in our study in the book of Job, and we're going to be in Job chapter 27. So in Job 27, it's a continuation of Job's it's a continuation of Job's response to his friend Bildad. In 25, Bildad had kind of had sort of come after Job and had made some statements about sort of talking about mankind in general and how man was a maggot and a son of man who's a worm, and had this very misanthropic view of mankind. And so Job responds to his friend Bildad in chapters 26 on in through chapter 31. So there's a long response that Job has to his friends, and part of it is to Bildad directly, but the other part is to his friends at large. And so in chapter 26, Job responded to his friends, and basically he sort of talked about how frail man is, and how man doesn't really how we can't know God. And then the second part of chapter 26, he goes into sort of the sort of this grandiose description of God and who God is and what God's capable of. And so Job in chapter 26, really the point that he's trying to make is here is that is really to say to his friend Bildad, there's no way that you can know what God is thinking and who God is, and not really who God is, but what God, what happens with God, because God is so much bigger than us, and he's so much powerful than we are. And at the end of chapter 26, he said, "Indeed, these are the mere edges of his ways." And this description that he gives of God is he says, with all of this that I've described about God, that is just a glimpse of who he is, and that's just a glimpse of his power, and how small of a whisper we hear from him or hear of him. And he said, but the thunder of his power, who can understand? And so Job's response, first of all, to Bildad was to say, there's no way that you can know what God is thinking and what God is doing, because by your own admission, man is frail and man is nothing, and so how can anybody understand what God is doing? And in chapter 27, Job really hits on two different things here. The first part of 27 is the first first 6 verses are Job reaffirming his innocence, and we've heard this over and over and over again. But in 27, Job is going to make some declarative statements that he's not made historically, and so what we're seeing with Job is this faith that he has that is really becoming more, as I've talked about before, more about faith in who God is, and not faith in what God does. And so Job, again, is really developing a strong and deeply held faith in spite of his circumstances. And then in verses 7 through 10, he's gonna sort of change his perspective a little bit, and really what he's gonna say is I've had enough, is basically sort of the point of 7 through 10. He's basically going to say, that the people that are speaking against me, and the people that are rising up against me, and the people that are doing this stuff and accusing me of these things, they're really more acting like the wicked person than what they're saying that I'm doing, that's wicked. And so there's, he sort of turns the tables. And then in verses 11 and 12, then we see Job really go on the offensive. And Job says, let me tell you something about God. Since you seem to know everything, you're not quite getting it. So let me explain very clearly to you something about God and who God is and how God works. And then in verses 13 through 23, really it's Job's way of saying, this is the end result. This is what's going to happen to the wicked man, to the person who doesn't honor God, to the person who's living outside of the words of God. And again, in verses 13 through 23, really serve as a warning to his friends to go, look, you think you know what's going on, you really don't. The way that you're living is not really righteous, and this is what's going to happen unless something changes. And so with all that being said, We're going to dive into Job chapter 27, and we'll read a few verses and talk about it, and we'll continue on. And this is what it says, chapter 27, starting in verse 1. Moreover, Job continued his discourse. Job continued what he was saying. He hasn't stopped speaking yet. He says, As God lives, who has taken away my justice, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter. Well, I want to stop here for just a minute and sort of talk about this, because what Job is doing here is, it sounds like Job is complaining, and maybe he sort of is, but really what Job is saying here is that even though he's experienced this, even though he's in the midst of this, when he says, as God lives, who has taken away my justice, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter, and Job's soul is bitter, and Job is hurting, and Job does feel like he's been treated unjustly, and again, we know this, Job doesn't, but in spite of this, in spite of these things, as long as my breath is in me, and the breath of God in my nostrils, my lips will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. So verses 1 through 4 there are this very declarative statement where Job is saying that as God lives, and as the Almighty lives, and as long as breath is in me, and as long as God's breath is in my nostrils, I'm not going to speak wickedness. My tongue is not going to utter deceit. I'm not going to sin in spite of the circumstances that I'm living in. And for me, this is huge, because so many times what happens is we allow these situations, these circumstances, if we feel like we've been treated unfairly, we allow these things to sort of set up camp in our minds, and we go, okay, well, God obviously is punishing me. God's not, this isn't fair, this isn't right, and what we do is we assign sort of these negative things to God, and then what happens is that can lead us into rebellion if we're not careful. And I know in my life that's happened many times, where I felt like things happened that weren't right, that weren't fair. Maybe I didn't understand things, and instead of really drawing my line in the sand and saying, this is the life I'm going to live, and this is the faith that I'm going to have, so many times what I've done is I've sort of let that lead me into rebellion, and I've sort of let that lead my focus off of God into other things. And Job is saying here very clearly, I'm not going to do that. My lips will not speak wickedness, my tongue will not utter deceit. And verses 5 and 6 I love. 5 and 6 is really verse 5 particularly is really a dig at his friends. He says, far be it from me that I should say you are right. And what Job is saying here is he's saying, in spite of the fact that I'm not going to sin, I'm not going to speak badly against God, I'm not going to speak wickedness, I'm not going to utter deceit, I'm not going to do these things because that's not the right thing to do. In addition to that, Job is saying not only that, but also I'm not going to live this life and make you and prove you right, and prove that what you've said about me all along is the case. And so many times, even in my job, I counsel people, and I try to sort of give them, help them understand better ways of handling things. And so many times, I'll say, if this happens and then you fall into this trap, you're making everyone else out that may be against you out to be honest. For instance, I'll tell them a lot of times, the first time I meet them, I'll say, don't use drugs. And they'll say, okay. And I'll say, and this is an important one, because you shouldn't use drugs. But also, if someone calls me and tells me that you're using drugs, and I drug test you, and you're positive for drugs, then you're making them out to be the truth tellers, and you're making yourself out to be a liar. So don't fall into that game. Don't play that game. Don't get into that, so that if someone accuses you of that, you won't make them out to be the honest ones. And that's exactly what Job is saying here. Is he's saying, far be it from me that I should say that you are right. Far be it from me that by my actions I would demonstrate that what you're saying about me is true. So not only am I going to do the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing, but I'm also going to do the right thing because I know if I don't, then it's just going to give you credibility, and it's going to prove you right, and I'm not going to do that. He says, till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. In verse 6, my righteousness I hold fast, and I will not let it go. My heart shall not reproach me as long as I live. And there's this very clear, very defined, very 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 solid declarative statement here that Job is saying, and really what he's doing is he's making this commitment to say, no matter what happens, no matter how bad things get, no matter how bad things have been, I'm not going to sin. I'm not going to fall away. I'm not going to be unrighteous. I'm not going to abandon my faith. I'm not going to speak lies. I'm not going to do these things no matter what. And this is such a far cry from Job early on when this happened, when Job was saying things like, I wish the day that I was conceived were wiped off the calendar, and I wish the day that I was born never happened, and I wish when I was born they had just let me die as a child so that I wouldn't have to live and experience all of this pain. Now we've seen this massive shift in Job's life where Job is saying, no matter what happens, no matter how bad things have been, are, or will be, this is my declaration. I'm not going to sin. I'm not going to be unrighteous. I'm not going to let my heart reproach me. I'm not going to let my emotions lead me away from God. I'm not going to let my heart lead me into sin as long as I live. And I love verses 1 through 6 because again, this is an incredible declarative statement by Job about his life, so that's verses 1 through 6. And again, what he's going to do now, just like he did in chapter 26, he's going to sort of change gears a little bit and kind of change and sort of turn back towards his friends. And verses 7 through 10 say this: may my enemy be like the wicked, and he who rises up against me like the unrighteous. Again, he's really calling for God's justice here, and he's really, what he's saying here is I've not been wicked, I've not been unrighteous. This is my life, this is what I've done, and this is the stand that I'm making. Now those who are wicked, those who are my enemy, those who are rising up against me, may they be like the unrighteous. May God treat them the way that he would the unrighteous or the wicked. Verse 8, for what is the hope of the hypocrite, though he may gain much, if God takes away his life? Will God hear his cry when trouble comes upon him? Will he delight himself, verse 10, will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call on God? And so what he's saying here in verses 7 through 10 is he's saying, this is really, again, sort of kind of transitioning into a warning to his friends, to say the people that are rising up against me, the people that are speaking against me, the people who really are my enemies at this point, may they be like the wicked. May they be treated by God the way that they deserve to be treated. And it's not, I don't think that Job is necessarily overtly asking for bad things to happen to his friends. I think this is Job saying, again, to his friends there, this warning there, that I'm not the wicked one, and somewhere in this somebody's wicked, and it's not me, and if it's you, then this is what's going to happen. And there's a warning there. He says, for what is the hope of the hypocrite, though he may gain much, though he may gain a lot of things, though he may be successful, if God takes away his life? At the end of this, if God kills him, if God takes his life from him, what benefit was there? What gain was there in living like this? He said, will God hear his cry when trouble comes upon him? Will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call on God? And there's in verses 9 and 10, I think this is really interesting because he says, will God hear his cry when trouble comes upon him? Will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call on God? And it's almost like that's a rebuttal to his friends, to say, I'm the one that's calling on God. I'm the one, troubles come upon me. I've delighted myself in God. I've made this stand. I've made the statement. I'm calling on God. Will the wicked here? Will the person who rises up against me, if this person who's wicked, who doesn't really follow God, when bad things happen, are they going to call on God? And really what he's doing is he's asking his friends, are you going to do this? If you were to experience what I'm experiencing right now, would you call on God? And there's a sort of an impugning of their character and of their faith, because it's been very easy for them to go after Job, to say, you haven't done this, or you've done that, or you deserve this, or you deserve that, when they're not the ones in the midst of what Job has been in the midst of. And so there's this strong warning that Job gives them when he asks them this. And then verses 11 and 12, he says, I will teach you about the hand of God, what is with the Almighty, I will not conceal. Surely all of you have seen it. Why then do you behave with complete nonsense? And Job says, since clearly you don't know what's going on, since clearly you're wrong and you've been wrong, let me tell you about God. And this has to be a a difficult thing for his friends to hear. because again, in their culture, Job is the one in sin because Job is the one experiencing negative consequences. And so for Job to be the one to shift the argument around, to be the one to go, okay, I'm the one that's being righteous, and I'm the one that's following God, and I'm always going to follow God, and I'm always going to have my righteousness, and these are the things that I'm doing and that I'm going to do. But you, on the other hand, you know, are you going to call on God when this happens? Are you going to be willing to live for God in the midst of all of this stuff? And Job, the implication there is Job's kind of going, probably not. And then Job, having lost everything, you know, covered in sores and pain, and you know everything just being completely chaotic in his life, for Job to turn around and say, "Let me tell you about God now. You've told me," he wouldn't say this, but you've told me for 26 chapters about God. Let me show you something about God. And so that had to have been a particularly tough thing for his friends to hear. Verse 13, this is the portion of a wicked man with God, and the heritage of oppressors received from the Almighty. And so he says, this is the end. This is what's going to happen to the wicked man, to the truly wicked, to those that are not living for God, for those that are not living lives that honor God. And he said, this is the portion of a wicked man with God, or from God, and the heritage of the oppressors received from the Almighty. Verse 14, if his children are multiplied, it is for the sword, and his offspring shall not be satisfied with bread. You see, normally in Scripture, what we see is children are a gift from God. I think it says in Psalms. I may be off there, but I think it's in the Psalms where it says that blessed is the man whose quiver is full. In Genesis 3, there's the command there to be fruitful and multiply, and throughout Scripture, children are viewed as a blessing from God. And in the Old Testament times, particularly if a woman couldn't have kids, she was believed to have been cursed by God. There was something wrong, and so children were generally a blessing. And so when Job says this, if his children are multiplied, it is for the sword. They're not born for a blessing. They're ultimately born for the sword. They're born to die. They're born to die. There's no good end to them. Their life is ultimately about the sword. And his offspring should not be satisfied with bread. His children are for the if his children are multiplied, is for the sword. If his offspring shall not be, and his offspring shall not be satisfied with bread, his offspring will never be satisfied. They'll never have enough. They'll consume everything about him. There's this picture of that Job is sort of painting here, that with somebody who's wicked, somebody who lives their life in rebellion to God, the things that are supposed to be a blessing aren't blessings to them. There's a violent end to their kids. Their kids will be ungrateful. They won't be satisfied with things. They'll consume him. They'll consume his resources. Nothing will be enough for them. He says, verse 15, those who survive him shall be buried in death, and their widows shall not weep. The people that live after him, death is their result. The people, his family members, the people that come after him, they'll be buried in death. They'll be buried in the grave. There's no good end for them. And he says, their widows, or his widows, shall not weep. There's no legacy. There's no pain that they're gone. So many times, we hear people that are, that maybe have done really horrible things, and we go, well, you hear people say, well, there's no remorse in their death. There's no mourning their death, because they were bad people. And so that's what Job is saying here is their widows will not weep. There's not going to be any emotion for them being gone. Verses 16 and 17. Though he heaps up silver like dust and piles up clothing like clay, he may pile it up, but the just will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. Everything that the wicked man gets, he may be successful. He may get money. He may gather clothes. He may do all of these things. His silver may be as common as dust to him, and his clothes may be like clay. He may just be just overrun with wealth. At the end of things, he won't take it with him. There won't be any legacy. There won't be any inheritance for his family. He says that the just will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. Even the things that the wicked spends his life gaining will ultimately go to the just and to the innocent. And so the things that he obtains won't stay with him. They won't stay with his family. They won't be they won't be an inheritance. Verse 18, he builds his house like a moth, like a booth which a watchman makes. Now this word that's used for moth can also mean maybe like a spider, or something like that. There's another sort of translation that would say that he builds his house in decay. That word booth there, and we've talked about this on Sunday morning some, there the Festival of Tabernacles, or the Festival of Booths, and that the booth is basically is a lean-to, and so it's a temporary kind of a shack, and in other parts of the Old Testament, this word that's used for booth, or this word that's used for sort of a makeshift house, is used as sort of a way of talking about like a house that has disdain on it, or a house that's cursed, or something like that. And so what he's saying here is this wicked man, he builds his house in like a moth, or like this very temporary thing, and there's nothing to it, like a booth, or like a lean-to which a watchman makes. There's no legacy. There's nothing to pass on to his family. The house that he makes won't last. It won't. It's like everything else in his life. It'll be gone without much work. Verse 19, he says, like the rich man will lie up, but not be gathered up. He opens his eyes, and he is no more. And he says the rich man, and I don't think this is necessarily saying like for rich people, but this is more talking about like the wicked person who has gathered all of this wealth, this rich person. And he says he'll lie down, but he won't be gathered up. There's nothing. Nothing will happen afterwards. He's once he dies, that's it. There's nothing. Some of the other texts will read but shall not add, or do it again, but take away nothing. Kind of this idea of once he's gone. He's gone. He won't be gathered up. There's nothing after this. He opens his eyes, and he is no more, and that's it. He lives, and he gets what he gets, and then he's dead, and that's the end of it. And it's sort of a bleak kind of sort of a bleak existence there, just living for what you can get, and then you die. And then verses 20 through 23 sort of go into a little bit more detail. It says this: terrors overtake him like a flood, a tempest steals him away in the night, the east wind carries him away, and he is gone. It sweeps him out of his place, it hurls against him and does not spare. He flees desperately from his power. Men shall clap their hands at him and shall hiss him out of his place. So verses 20 through 22 sort of go into a little bit more illustrative detail about kind of the death of the wicked, and what he's saying here is even the death of the wicked isn't peaceful. Terrors overtake him like a flood. A tempest steals him. This storm steals him away in the night. The wind carries him away. It sweeps him out of his place. It hurls against him, and it doesn't spare. It says he flees desperately from his power, and so this wicked man is doing everything he can to survive, and even his death won't be peaceful. His life wasn't peaceful. Everything that he got is going to be given away. His kids will live for the sword. His offspring will never be satisfied. They won't cry when he's dead. And then when he finally does die, it won't even be a peaceful death. There's nothing peaceful about the life of the wicked. And he says, men shall clap their hands at him and shall hiss him out of his place. And even this is talking about in that culture there, when someone was being kind of if someone was giving a speech and it was unpopular, or they said something people didn't like, they would clap their hands and they would drown him out, or they would hiss at him and scream at him and tell him to leave. And so even even the way that he's treated by other people won't be, it'll be bad. That he won't find any. He won't have good company, I guess is probably the best way to describe that. And so again, through 13 through 23, really it's Job sort of switching back around to say, I've not been the wicked one. I've been the one that's been righteous. But there is a warning here for you guys, because you are really acting wicked by making these accusations, by saying things about me that aren't true, by treating me the way that you have. That this is what happens to the wicked man, and this is a warning to you that if you don't change something, this may be what ends up happening to you. And so So that's it. That's Job chapter 27. Again, we've got several chapters to go through where Job continues on in his address to his friends. In chapter 28, Job is going to talk a lot about wisdom. And we're going to talk about sort of how that plays into the friends and how they've treated him. And then, yeah, like I said, on through chapter 31. So for the next few weeks, we're going to be, we're going to really dig into what Job was saying to his friends. And then that'll be it from Job. We won't hear from Job again until I think chapter 42, as a matter of fact. I think, the friends will respond, and then we're going to hear from God, and then in chapter 42 is when Job is going to respond one last time. So once we get finished with chapter 31, we won't hear. Well, let me rephrase that. So Job will respond to God in chapter 40, but it's a very short verse, or a very short passage. So that's what we've got. Let me pray for you, and then we'll be done with this week's Bible study. God, we thank you for today. Thank you for your word, and my prayer is that we would be willing to make these declarative statements like Job has made, God. That we would be willing to make these statements to say that no matter what the circumstances, no matter what the problems, God, we're not going to speak deceitfully. We're not going to, our hearts will not be deceitful. We're not going to speak wickedness, God. That as long as there's breath in our lungs, and as long as your breath is in our nostrils, God, that we're going to be faithful to you. Help us to be people of faith. God, I pray for our church that you would continue to bless us, keep us well, and I pray for our leaders, our federal, our state and local leaders, God, that pray that you would give them wisdom, that you would lead through them, Father, and ultimately, God, in our lives, that you would be glorified. And until we meet again, Lord, I just pray that your blessings on our church and on the people that we come into contact with, and help us to, God, help us to be a witness to you, and give us opportunities to share the story of your son Jesus with somebody as we go through the rest of our week. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.